And welcome, everyone. My name is Eesha. I'm a program officer with the Gender and Reproductive Equity Grantmaking team at Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies. A little bit of background about us. At Schusterman Family Philanthropies, we work to advance racial, gender, and economic equity, as well as to foster a more joyful and diverse Jewish community. Within the GRE portfolio, we support reproductive knowledge, freedom, and power through sex education, birth equity, and access to abortion. We advance policies that build women's economic power, particularly in support of caregivers and care workers. We support women's safety and security broadly, including but not limited to gender-based violence, and build political power for women in state at the national levels. This grant making really came about in response to the start, or the explosion, I should say, of the Me Too movement in 2017. In 2020, though, we grew significantly and built out a national portfolio to more systematically support organizations across the US engaged in gender and reproductive equity work. And we doubled down after the leak of the Dobbs decision, increasing both the size and the scope of our portfolio. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our friends at Pivotal Ventures, who we partnered with to organize this plenary, because they're engaged in some of the very same work through high-impact investments, partnerships, and policy and advocacy. Pivotal's Centering Women and Girls of Color strategy is an intersectional and intergenerational effort that aims to advance equitable social progress by affirming and centering the power of women and girls across the US. Their strategy was launched to address these disparities, the disparities that we'll talk about here, and to ensure that people closest to those problems have a role and a prominent role in designing those solutions. In both grantmaking for Schusterman and for Pivotal, we prioritize efforts led by and informed by the people most impacted by structural inequities, including Black, Indigenous, and women and girls of color, transgender and gender nonconforming people, and youth. We know that these are the communities bringing the vision, energy, and solutions to the work. To start this panel, though, we must acknowledge our current political moment, as has been done over the past couple of days, I think. Anti-trans legislation is rampant across the states, abortion access has been severely rolled back, and the broader attacks on democracy and voting rights threaten some of the core democratic principles in the US. All of these fights present us with increased threats to bodily autonomy and basic human rights. And yet, when it is so clear that these attacks on our rights are always and also attacks on the safety and security of our communities, funding and work to address gendered, racialized, and sexualized violence remains siloed. We know, though, that in order to be effective, our funding and our work must address root causes that cut across many components of gender justice, including, but not limited to, reproductive justice, housing justice, disability justice, racial justice, economic justice, and more. I'm so honored to have our panelists, Tarana Burke of Me Too International, whose birthday was just 2 days ago. Yesterday. Aleyamma Mathew of Collective Future Fund, and Maheen Kaleem of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, partners for both Schusterman and Pivotal Ventures. We're excited to reflect on these connections and the evolving movement to end gender-based violence and advance gender justice. And while I'd love to share their extensive bios and accolades, I also want to make sure we can learn from their wisdom and experience. Their full bios are available in the Whova app, as I learned it's called this morning. Thank you, Melanie. Or on the Feminist Funded 23 website. But for now, we'll jump right in. And to jump in, Aleyamma, I want to ground us in some context. You've obviously worked in the funding space for many years, and for those of us who are less familiar, I'm hoping you'll share a little bit about the history of philanthropic funding to address gendered, racialized, and sexualized violence.
Thank you, Eesha, and welcome everyone to this session. My name is Aleyamma Mathew, and I'm the Executive Director of the Collective Future Fund. The Collective Future Fund is a collaborative philanthropic fund that was created in 2019. We seek to end all forms of violence by specifically focusing on the intersection of racialized, sexualized, and gendered violence. I'm going to say that again. We specifically work at the intersection of racialized, sexualized, and gendered violence. We, the people that sit at this intersection, are both hyper-visible and absolutely invisible at the same time. They are visible, we are visible to the state and invisible in philanthropy. When CFF was created in 2019, it was created with the intention to leverage the momentum of the Me Too movement and expand the amount of resources that were available for gender-based violence work. As we evolved in the past 4 years, we were evolving against these cascading crises that we've been hearing about, and also opportunities. Me Too movement brought the visibility of survivors to the forefront of our consciousness and our conversations. Black Lives raised the visibility of police violence and helped to start a racial reckoning that landed in the rise of and the visibility of far-right white nationalism. Against all of that, we survived through a global pandemic. Philanthropy responded to each of these crises. They responded through their siloed portfolios, and while everyone else was experiencing these cascading historical global events, concurrently and intersectionally, philanthropy was continuing to fund through their silos. The work of CFF is to course correct by funding who philanthropy has historically left behind and who consistently live with violence every day. We prioritize survivor-led organizations and the leadership of Black, Indigenous, women of color, and expansive people of color. In other words, the leaders at the epicenter of movement building who also happen to be the focus of right-wing counterattacks. In 2020, during the pandemic, CFF moved $4 million in rapid response grant making to frontline organizations. The biggest observation I walked away with was that many of our grantee partners overnight became mutual aid associations and provided support where the government failed to do so. This is the first crisis where we did not receive money from FEMA. There was no Red Cross that showed up. It was local community-based organizations that came to the rescue. We followed up with that funding by releasing $11 million in multi-year funding because we knew that after 2020, sustainability was going to be an issue, and this was an unpredictable period. Eesha wanted me to set some context of how we got here, and I will warn you that this is not a happy story. The story of gender justice funding around violence is the tale of two cities. One is the story of movements and movement leaders that have been leading and leading and leading and leading movements. Some of us are really tired, and we're still leading.
Baby.
The other story is about social justice philanthropy, struggling to invest in solutions for the future, but failing to invest deeply and for the long term in our communities. I hear grantees say they're constantly toggling between racial justice funders who tell them this is a gender issue and gender justice funders who say this is a racial justice issue. I also hear grantees saying that women of color exist in the global but not in US portfolios. So what is happening here? How did we get here? What's next if we don't do something now? So I sort of pulled some data points. Some of it most people in this room may have heard, but I'm going to repeat some of it. And then most recently, I discovered a startling data point. Thank you. So in response to Tarana's lifetime work, but in 2017, when #MeToo went viral, philanthropic interventions to support women and girls of color, increased relative to the overall charitable giving. But it is still very minuscule. So out of all philanthropic givings, which totals $7.1 billion, only 1.6% of philanthropic funding goes to women and girls. 1.6. Out of the 7.1 billion, only 0.5% of funding goes to women and girls of color. Funding for trans communities was reported as small as 0.015%. Two of the leading funders in this area was the federal government through the Violence Against Women's Act, and the other funder was the Novo Foundation. The Novo Foundation announced that it would sunset in their work in 2020, and that is a total of over $200 million. That will be sunsetted between 2023 and 2024. Both the historic underfunding and this sunsetting creates a tremendous gap that is left. If there's one lesson we learned is that this work cannot be sustained by one or two donors. We must have more people. The other thing we learned is that gender-based violence must be seen as an intersecting issue within racial justice, immigrant, disability, and other social justice portfolios. I want to also say that the same anti-gender forces that are attacking gender bodies in the US are also financing many anti-gender efforts globally. Over the past few years, we've witnessed the increased visibility of gendered violence, which is inextricably linked to the rise in anti-right and anti-gender discourse and political activity. From white supremacist vigilante violence, insurrections, and policing to the exploitation of essential workers in sectors where vulnerability is tied to gender, to the Dobbs decision overturning constitutional protections for abortion, to hundreds and hundreds of anti-trans bills, to the pervasiveness of sexual violence that the Me Too movement brought into the public conversation and linked to abuses at the workplace. These statistics are part of global trends that cannot be viewed in isolation, where these crackdowns draw from a strikingly similar playbook used by right-wing groups organizing in other countries. The particularly disturbing data point that I discovered is that $6.2 billion goes from US-based organizations to fund anti-gender movements in the global South, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That $6.2 billion comes from 55 organizations. What this means to me is that women of color and gender expansive people have been waging this war in the belly of the beast, and that's not DC, it is the United States. So I want to just end, I know this is a very grim picture, but I want to just end with a quote that political scientist Erica Chenoweth and Zoe Marks had noted. And it says, quote, "Understanding the relationship between sexism and democratic backsliding is vital for those who wish to fight back against both. Established autocrats and right-wing nationalist leaders in contested democracies are united in their use of hierarchical gender relations to shore up nationalistic, top-down, male-dominated rule. Having long fought against social hierarchies that consolidate power in the hands of the few, feminist movements are the most powerful weapons against authoritarianism. Those who wish to reverse the global democratic decline cannot afford to ignore them." So I just want to leave you with that context of where we are right now, and what we need to do is that CFF is a collaborative fund. We invite other funders to join this table. We work very closely with our grantee partners, and they are experts in so many different movements and can center gender-based violence. But this is a call to philanthropy that we must act now if we're going to build the future that we want to see.
Thank you. She did say it would be a grim picture, and that is what you delivered. I do want to shift a little bit, though, and take us out of that despair and find some hope, right? That's someone said earlier on a panel this morning that this room is what gives us hope, and there are opportunities here in this room. So Tarana, we'll start with you, but I'm curious, what are some of the opportunities that you see when it comes to getting more philanthropic organizations more deeply invested in supporting gendered, racialized, sexualized violence, maybe some of the intersections of, the racial justice and the gender justice? What are some things that you're excited about and opportunities that you're seeing?
Excited, okay. Trying to shake that off. I appreciate that though, really, because that is my lived reality. So, but I am excited. Our partners are here, you all. And I think that what I have experienced, so first of all, Me Too International is an organization. I need everybody to know that. People don't. I am often mistaken for the leader of other organizations and other movements. But we have an organization. It is 5 years old. And what has kept us afloat and kept us thriving is the foundations, the relationships we have with foundations that get it. And not only get it, but are determined to get it and are constantly learning and expanding. And so what makes me hopeful, and I was saying a little bit of this earlier, is that I worked inside of philanthropy, and I worked as a fundraiser, as a development person, right? I always had a job while I was doing my organizing on the side. And that job was raising money for the nonprofits that I worked for. So I know how philanthropy works. And then one of my jobs was giving out money. So I know how philanthropy works on both sides. So, that portfolio frigidity, y'all know, is that paralyzation around the portfolio thing is really so problematic. And I'm gonna tell you a quick story. I'm gonna try to make it quick. But when Me Too first started in Alabama, I was living in Selma, and I had a very small, some people probably heard this, but I had a very small grant from Third Wave. And remember Third Wave? So, and Mia was there then. Mia, yeah, exactly. I know, good times, good times. And, but that grant was for leadership development. I was running a girls group, a leadership development group for little black girls in the Black Belt. And in my, and that work was, and this is sort of a microcosm of now, right? In Selma at the time, the mayor of Selma was the same mayor that was there in '65, Joe Smitherman. Racist white mayor, was horrible. We were organizing against police brutality, which was rampant, still is, but was really rampant. We were organizing to get Joe Smitherman out of office because he was not unlike the leadership that we see now. In the community. And the policies that were happening in education and in law enforcement in Selma were really wreaking havoc on our young people. And nobody was paying attention to black girls. If you remember, early 2000s, there were a lot of efforts around black boys happening around the country, but not very many around black girls. So I started Just Be Inc. to focus on black girls in that community. And Third Wave had given us this small grant. In my work with the black girls, I realized, y'all know the Me Too story, some of you do, but I discovered how much sexual violence was rampant also in our community amongst our girls. And so I had to pivot, I decided to pivot inside of the leadership work to focus on sexual violence. It wasn't the plan, it just needed to happen, and that organizer spirit said this needed to happen. I didn't think the funding existed for this work because I had not placed it inside of organizing. I was trying to figure out what that looked like. So we just started doing that work out of our pocket, right? Just raise the money. I used to call this the paycheck to paycheck movement. When I got a little bit of money, when I got paid, me and my girlfriend had opposite pay weeks, and we would just peel a little money aside and do what we needed. So in the check-in with Mia, we finished our check-in, and she said, "What else is going on?" And I said, well, I've been doing this program called Me Too in the schools with my kids. And she was like, well, what's that? And I told her. And she was like, that's amazing. Because we had organized to get this this dean out of the high school, whatever, who was doing terrible things. Anyway, she was like, that's amazing, blah, blah, blah. You turn in leadership. She connected the dots. She was like, well, Tarana, that is leadership development. I mean, you know how y'all do, program officers, they get it. She gave me the language. She was like, well, that's technically leadership development because you're organizing your girls and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay. And she said, I have an extra $3,000, which please understand at that time, $3,000 was a $3 million grant to me. And she's like, I want to give this to you. It's Gen Op, but I want to put it towards that work. I used that $3,000 for a year. I promise you I did. For a year. We peeled off and peeled off and peeled off that money. What makes me hopeful is that same thing happens to us now when I talk to our program officers and they hear us. We don't go asking for money. We just talk to them and they hear us and they hear what we're trying to do. What Mia did was give me hope that work was real. That work to me was personal and passionate at the time. It was just what had to be done. I did not see a pathway for funding because nobody said that was real work until she said, this is real work. And she gave it language, she gave it structure, and then I was like, oh, okay, I get it, I see it. It made me think about it differently. Now we talk to our folks all the time, and they fight for us. Now, I know there's a hierarchy, right? We have our program officers who have to make the pitch to their board and blah, 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 blah. What needs to happen, first of all, y'all gotta get these portfolios together. And I know it's not your job to do that. I know it's hard to do that. But what I mean by that is this, when just give me a second. When Black Lives Matter happened, I was inside of philanthropy. And what I saw people do was say, something has to change. Right? Something has to happen. But because you had a body in the street, and I'm talking about when Mike Brown happened, I should say, when Ferguson happened, because there was a body in the street that you can keep referring to. We all saw this boy's body in the street for 4 hours, and it was horrific, right? When Eric Garner happened, we had that video that we can keep referring to. Same thing happened with George Floyd. That didn't happen for Me Too, right? We had the explosion, and we had a lot of media around it, but you didn't have something that made people feel like this was social justice. There was an injustice in that way. So when around the racial justice issue, there was this way in which people were like, we have to do something about this. Look at this. We have to respond to this thing. With sexual violence, we have to make this case. And so what I get, and what I'm sure my, other folks in the room who are doing work like this get, is help me understand how this is a movement. And so what the folks who advocate for us inside of philanthropy always come back to me and say, I'm getting some pushback around how this fits inside of, and I know y'all don't mean it, and I know y'all feel bad when you have to come back to me and say this foolish shit, right? And I get it. I feel bad for y'all. But what I'm saying is we have to work together, and you have to work together with your other grantees, because there has to be a reimagining. This is not going to be a movement that's going to have the wins that you're used to. Your board member's not going to be able to brag about how many countable da-da-da-da-das. This is about survivors and survivor justice. And it looks different than what you've seen before. You're not going to have a body that you can martyr and put up in the world. We are the walking wounded, us survivors in the world. The other thing is you're going to have to let the survivors that are among you speak. Because they're in this room, they're in your boardrooms, they're here, and y'all can't speak. Y'all can't say anything because it's against the rules. You're gonna have to break some of them rules because you actually do know what survivor justice is, because a lot of y'all are living it. and you can't bring that into your workplace. Black people who work in philanthropy can talk about racial justice, right? Y'all stand up and say, I know this has to be done because I'm a black person in America, but you can't stand up and say, I know this has to be done because I'm a black survivor, because I'm a woman survivor. That's also not okay. If it's your choice, obviously. Part of the problem is that we can't bring survivor justice. It's not about the Me Too movement, it's about survivor justice. The Me Too movement was just a vehicle to amplify the horrific state of gender-based sexual violence in the world. In some ways, I wish I could take Me Too out of your head and look at the actual people who are trying to talk about this issue. When gun violence, y'all know I'm terrible. Look at the number and just know that my brain understand what's happening up here. Right after Me Too went viral, Parkland happened. And people told me, it's over for y'all because it's all gonna be about gun violence now. And I'm like, y'all don't see the connection between gun violence and sexual violence? Last summer, when Dobbs happened, was that last summer or the summer before? Last summer, everybody was like, it's over for y'all because it's reproductive justice. And I'm like, every single one of the most egregious part of all of these laws is about sexual violence. The point I'm making as I close is that what gives me hope is that I know a lot of y'all in this room get it. But we have to go outside of this room. We keep gathering and talking to each other when really we have to organize about who's not in this space that we have to talk to. There is a larger conversation and there's more money. We gather like this is where the money is. The money is here, but there's more money. And the people who are not in this room, who have more money, are the people who we have to organize and get to understand. So the takeaways are, we need to educate ourselves, all of us collectively, about how this is different. They're not gonna get their pretty little wins like they're used to. This movement is different. That's number one. Number two, you cannot have a real, robust conversation about any of these issues that they care about. Reproductive justice, gun violence, climate change, any of it, if you don't, police violence, any of it, mass incarceration, if you don't include sexual violence. It's a lie. It's not complete. This is not about the Me Too movement. Because I promise you, 5 years ago, y'all wouldn't even have me up here. Y'all wouldn't even be thinking about me at all. I'd be right in the audience like, excuse me, can I get your business card? I'd love to talk to you about this work I'm doing. It's really, really important. But now that I'm here and I got the mic, I'm trying to tell y'all something. Forget about hashtags and Me Too. This issue is as important as every other issue. We are all fighting the same demon. Don't get me to preaching. And these demons are coming for all of us. We don't have time for silos. That's not what you asked me, I know.
That was great.
But I'm here.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
You want me to go after that? All right.
Come on.
Well, I'm going to take your invitation, Tarana, and break a rule, which I don't normally break, but part of what we talk about a lot is that we can't talk about violence. And people don't fund this work because they don't want to talk about violence. In the context of girls and gender-expansive youth, they definitely don't want to talk about child sexual abuse and sexual violence against children. So I'm going to name that when I was a young person, I experienced sexual violence in a hotel across the street. And I say that because all of this work is rooted in what, in my experience, young people have actually demanded of us. So, Grantmakers for Girls of Color was created by people in this room because young people were demanding to be heard. When there were all of these initiatives that were calling for a large investment in men and boys of color, it was mostly women, girls, and gender-expansive youth that were asking for those investments. And yet we're left out of the conversation because patriarchy and because white supremacy and because all of those things. Part of where this conversation about what it means to, where we get hope and what it means to, what this work requires us to do, I think starts with, for us, because we exist because young people asked us to, is what we say. We are like Collective Future Fund, a funder intermediary that mobilizes resources to support movements and organizations that are led by and center girls and gender expansive youth of color. And because of that, we have to listen to how they are defining things, and we are charged with actually doing that. I was talking to somebody yesterday about safety, and there was this horrific conversation. A grantee partner called me because a funder told her young person that the NAP ministry was BS, and that organizing actually requires rigor and labor and work. And this young person said, no, rest is actually political for me. I've been organizing since I was 12. And actually one of our grantee partners did some research, some participatory action research during the pandemic with girls and gender expansive youth about radical visions of safety. It's Alliance for Girls. And in their definition of safety, young people articulated rest and restoration. They wrote it in the definition. And so I say that to say that for us, if we're going to build philanthropic strategies that resource the liberated futures that they are dreaming, then we actually have to relanguage things. A lot of times funders will say, well, what issues do you focus on? And we'll be like, they're leading all the movements. It's all the issues. Where I have seen, so I think there's one side, which is, the original question that Eesha had posed was, G4GC, as we affectionately call it, has been able to galvanize kind of a diverse community of folks. Part of that is because we have to, because of all the statistics that Aleyamma was noticing. Nobody wants to fund this work because it feels messy, it feels intractable, it's gonna take forever, we don't wanna talk about it. And then there is an active resistance to seeing the leadership of girls and young people, right? Like that we like to think it's cute. And what do we do with cute things? We give them a little something. We don't actually meaningfully and robustly decenter and separate ourselves to say, I'm just gonna give you a bunch of money and see what you do with it. I have talked to corporations and banks who were creating all these programs that did everything except put cash into the hands of young people. And we know, as Tarana's story tells, that nobody can stretch a dollar like girls and gender expansive youth of color. So I think on the one side, we've had to kind of be creative about how we language things, but also how we, as our president, Dr. Monique Koufson says, how we combat the erasure of girls and gender expansive youth and the role they play in our communities. So that means we have to be everywhere. Like, people are talking about being tired. All of us are tired because we're at every single conference, because we are constantly like, and what about girls? And what about gender expansive youth? And let me go to this place. If it's in a democracy conversation, if it's in an economic justice conversation. So I think, we've been able to do it. And I will say, we in 3 years have raised and regranted $25 million to over 400 organizations in all 50 states, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And part of that is because of how we define who gets to be a co-investor, and this is, I know, going to be one of our calls to action. Often what we say is that we don't practice your grandfather's philanthropy, we practice our grandmother's philanthropy. And that means that we get what we get and we stretch what we can stretch, and we make whole what has been ripped from us. And when I think about how and why we've had to do it, on the one side, I gave you the, you've heard sort of the why we had to do it. In terms of what's been hopeful, it is that actually the hope is in, you can find survivors everywhere, you can find power everywhere, you can find girls and gender expansive youth of color leading everywhere. So it's actually not that difficult for us to help people locate what we are doing, and it is required of us because the dollars come in small, little siloed things that we have to sort of finesse and finagle, and oftentimes I say we wash the money a little bit so that we can move it back out to our grantees in a way that feels just and appropriate and in right relationship with them. So that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is that actually the way we practice amongst each other is deeply feminist. So one of the greatest privileges of my life has been kind of behind the scenes in the creation and formation of the 1 Billion for Black Girls campaign, of which Tarana is a co-founder, Monique, our president, is a co-founder, there are other co-founders in this room. when in 2020 we saw all those commitments to Black-led organizing, these 8 Black women called all their friends and basically said, we're gonna make a bold ask. And it was like a text thread. It was like 100 million, 200 million, and then Joanne Smith of Girls for Gender Equity said, why not $1 billion? Like, why do Black girls not deserve $1 billion more dollars? And we did it in a way where we launched it with other funder intermediaries. We launched it with the Ms. Foundation, with Southern Black Girls and Women's Consortium. And it was a campaign for the movement. It wasn't we are going to raise $1 billion for ourselves and only our organizations. It was we are inviting organizations like Daughters Beyond Incarceration, who's one of our grantees who's in the room, to be like, claim this for yourselves. Let's collectively ask for that. And that, I think, has given me a lot of hope because, you know, a lot of times we have a couple of other partnerships that we've launched with other funder intermediaries, and people will be like, oh, you guys work together? We move money to each other. Like, when I can't get a rapid response grant out, shout out to Alicia Sanchez-Gill, I will call her and be like, yo, can you move this money? I'll get you back later. So I guess I will say that, like, I think part of where we have been able to be successful in bringing kind of a diversity is because it's not that hard to find and talk about that power. But that translation is really important, as Tarana was saying. And then part of it is because if we move in all of the deeply intersectional feminist ways that we know how to do, and we actually operationalize it and put it into practice, it allows for us to get so many wins. And it does require that we unpack, it's messy. Like, we had to have real conversations like, well, who's holding the money and what's the governance structure? And do you take that meeting? But we actually need that money. I mean, we have to also make sure that we're inviting people into rooms and calling people in and putting each other. I'm only here because Aleyamma told somebody to put me on this panel, I think. So, like, I guess what I'm saying is that that gives me hope, is how we continue to actively, and it's not easy, do the work to do the resistance and the translation. The last thing I'll say about sexual violence, when the massacre in Atlanta happened, I had a funder who called me and said, where are the Asians? And I said, the Asians are most of those immigrant, women-led, anti-sexual violence organizations that have a very long history in this country, who also happen to be the people that are organizing around workers' rights, and also the Asians that are organizing around multiracial, combating anti-Blackness. It's all those organizations. And they were started because they were responding to gendered violence in their communities. And so I think part of it is, the hope is that I think we're starting to, thanks to movement leaders, build in and absorb language that actually allows us to see the power and the political nature of what it means to be a survivor and how we organize together. So I don't know if any of that made any sense, but I think my main point is, part of it is, we've been able to do it because we had to, and we have to continue to. It has been like so weird for me to have to talk to banks, but like, it's also been amazing because when you have the right people in those places, they will try to move money to you, and they will try to trust you enough. And they will finesse with you and finagle with you, and part of the role, I think, of intermediaries is to kind of shoulder that labor so that smaller organizations or organizations that are actually directly responding to people don't have to do it. But, so there's we have to, and then there's also the part where we've been successful because it's also not all our money, it's movement money, and so we've been able to push back against the structures that tell us that that there isn't a lot of, there's so much money. There's so much money. And we can get creative about how we play our lanes in order to capture all of it back.
Aleyamma, do you want to share things that are giving you hope?
Yeah, I mean, what's giving me hope right now is I'm gonna double down on what you just said, is actually the tremendous solidarity there is among gender funders right now, and funders of women and girls of color. There is coordination happening. You know, this panel came together because of the efforts of Pivotal Venture and the Schusterman Family Foundation, and in part what happened is that Earlier this year, a number of my grantee partners, including Tarana, came to me and said, you know, we're really worried about this funding cliff that's going to happen, and how can we organize together? And so the partnership between movement leaders and the Collective Future Fund that has emerged in this past year has given me hope that philanthropy and movement leaders can stand shoulder to shoulder at this time. The other thing that is giving me hope is actually this. I think, you know, is actually maybe not the hopeful thing that we can do right now is really to invest in the building of the infrastructure of gender-based violence-led organizations. When we did our rapid response in 2020 and released $4 million, one of the things we did was ask our current grantees for recommendations of groups that they work with closely. And what that revealed was an ecosystem of organizations that were working together in partnership and in relationship and complementing each other, supporting, you know, Every Black Girl, which is an organization in South Carolina, was recommended by Joanne Smith of Girls for Gender Equity. And that relationship was a relationship of support. She started that organization several years ago. Joanne Smith has ran Girls for Gender Equity for 20 years. So I think the ways that both philanthropy and movement leaders are coming together, and also how organizations or our grantee partners have come together. One big effort that happened a few years ago was a Survivors Summit, which was a coordination between Me Too, Justice for Migrant Women, Domestic Workers Alliance, and many, many other organizations that worked around National Women's Law Center, that worked around workers' rights, gender-based violence, and you know, and used various different mechanisms, including law and policy. So those types of partnerships are very hopeful to me, and I think one of the asks that I've received is like, how can we support more collaboration and ensure that that ecosystem is also funded and that coordination and partnership continues to take place.
Thank you. So as we run short on time here, shocking, who would have expected that to happen? I would invite each of you to just leave us with your call to action, and feel free to be as specific as you want. Maybe it's a particular grant-making practice that G4GC or CFF engage in, or a partnership. But I think, you know, just bringing these themes together of, if you're funding reproductive justice or abortion access or criminal justice or gun violence, you are already serving survivors in many ways. And the thing for us as funders to do is to really bring that nuance and that conversation in for ourselves and our own teams and for our board and leadership. But I'd invite you all to share your calls to action. Maybe we start with Maheen.
Sure. I have 3, I think. The first one is, I think we have to unpack our own stuff. Tanisha McCarris, who's speaking tomorrow, when I entered philanthropy, she said, sis, you have to heal your relationship to money if you're going to be a good steward of it. And I will say, like, when we launched the 1 billion campaign, like, people had their own stuff. Like, and you have to then combat the people who do not believe that Black women and girls deserve $1 billion, right? So I think we just have to do that work. And so I invite folks, whatever that question is for you, like, I invite you to sit with that, because whether you're raising the money and you're asking for it, or you're the steward of it, or you're doing both, if you're in an intermediary context or a women's fund, I would just invite you to do that work. I think it's important. The second thing is, look at your portfolios and ask where gender-based violence lives in your portfolios, and also ask where girls live in your portfolio, where young people live in your portfolio, and not just but actually the centering and how they're leading. Is my invitation, is like, go back and do that, do the math, look at your numbers, and if you need help, talk to us. Like, we are here to help people locate that and do that translation of that analysis. The third is, I would invite people to, if you are in a philanthropic space, I would encourage you to go to a housing funder or a criminal justice funder. I'm going to ask that each of you go to somebody who is funding in a sector that you don't normally find yourself in and figure out how to make that linkage for them. Because whether it's the gender linkage, or it's the violence linkage, or it's the youth linkage, whatever it is, the intersectional framework, I would ask you to each person to just pick one and try to do that, because the invitation is that we actually have to organize. That's good organizing. Like, staying in our lane is not good organizing, and if you come out of and you want to resource organizing, then we have to do it ourselves, and we have to get ourselves together, and that requires all of those things. And then the fourth is, if you need to move money to girls and you don't know where to do it, please talk to me or give us the money and we'll help the girls get it out. We have a lot of participatory grant making strategies, and so my other offering and invitation is, if you want to talk participatory grant making with young folks, I would love to do that. So those are my calls to action. I'll stop there.
That deserves a clap.
Yeah.
So many of my call to action overlaps with Maheen, but I will say this: we're gearing up for this next presidential election, and I know it brings like fear into all of our hearts and minds. We are, someone told me once, you have to experience trauma twice to know it's trauma. The first time it happens to you, the second time you understand it's trauma. And so as we walk into this next season of, what did you call it? Season 3 of trauma. I want us to remember something we learned during the pandemic, which is this quick release of funds in rapid response. When these movement moments happen, it's not just a moment to flush like all this money. It's a call to action to say, how do we build long-term sustainability from this movement moment? So, and where I'm going to is that as much as the name of my organization, this organization is called Collective Future Fund, we have to focus on the future, but also fund the present. The attacks that we have already been experiencing and our grantee partners are experiencing is only going to get worse. And so the need for rapid response funding, the need for like respite for movement leaders is really, really necessary right now. So as you're thinking about your long-term strategy and going through strategic planning for the long term, there must also be the release of funds that happen now. Also, I would say to underscore what Maheen said, I think a very simple action that you can all do is to go home and look at your portfolios and just ask yourself the question: how many of these organizations are women and girls of color-led organizations? How many of them are focused on the intersections of racialized, sexualized, and gendered violence? And use that as a baseline for how to move your institution. Create goals that you can add 5 or 10 more organizations to that portfolio. And then lastly, I will say, as a collaborative fund, I want to just recognize the other funders who are part of it. It's Pivotal Ventures, Wellspring, Schusterman Family Foundation, Ford Foundation. These are all large philanthropic institutions that support CFF because they do see it as a vehicle to support smaller organizations. And lastly, like, now is the time. The right wing has invested over 50 years of thinking and resources into building the machine that we are seeing right now. We have to make up that time in rapid speed right now in order to create the kind of safety that we imagine for this future. So I would say we have run out of time, so now is the time to be getting engaged around this issue.
Okay. The pressure. Well, I'm going to double click on both of your comments because I don't think there's a lot to add to that to say to philanthropy. Uncomplicate this, please. Please. For those of us who are writing the grants, who are asking you for money. There's Ana Oliveras from New York Women's Foundation, who I just adore, once said to me that we make this hard for no reason. It would just behoove all of us to uncomplicate this. not just the process, but there are ways, and I definitely understand there are those people in this room who don't have the power necessarily, but there is, and I know you didn't take these jobs to be organizers, but you are, right? I didn't take this job to do what I'm doing, but I'm doing it. But you are organizers on top of the jobs that you applied for. And that is just the reality. And part of that organizing work is to try to help to uncomplicate this process, uncomplicate the pipelines. You know, when you're in spaces and you hear people say, well, what does that have to do with racial justice, to your point? You have to educate your own selves. When you leave this room and you hear these tidbits in these conferences, do the extra work to educate yourself to understand why sexual violence is related to racial justice, right? Why, when you, not, you know, Black women and Native women and other women of color listen to what we're telling you about what's happening, read on your own so that you can have the armor to go back and talk to whoever the roadblock is in your space. Also, if you're doing the healing work for yourself as survivors, we have resources for you, right? Use those resources, because if it helps you, and this probably sounds a little selfish, I'm not saying to heal yourself so you can help us, but that's probably a block for people. And there are resources for that too, because I do think it's unfair that people are not able to stand in their survivorship who want to. I've had lots of people in the philanthropy say, I can't say anything about this, or I want to, and I think that's not okay, right? Survivors exist, and I know they are here, and I know they want to bring that expertise into the space so that they can use that to talk about why survivor leadership is necessary and real. And then, you know, I talk about this all the time. I am a steward in my mind of this work. I've had so many people ask me, can they say Me Too? And I think about it, I use this story about planting a tree. Like, if it's something that I sort of discovered that works, and it can work for everybody, right? Like, if you discovered a tree growing in your backyard and you realized the fruit from that tree could heal people, would you hoard it or would you share it? Right? I would hope that people would take the fruit from that tree and collect it and give it to all their neighbors and say, plant this and grow it and keep planting it and have other people grow it. We have to think about that in abundance. There's so much, not just resources and money, there's so much that has to happen, and we all have what's necessary to make that happen. We have to keep planting and growing and planting and growing, because yes, we're running out of time, but we really are winning. And I'll try to leave people with that from a hopeful perspective. These people are acting the way they're acting because we are winning. They are acting the way they're acting. If you think about when somebody is dying, not to be morbid, but if you are drowning, you're gonna fight like hell to save your life. They're dying. They're the last of a dying breed. And they're acting this way, and they're fighting and throwing everything they have at it because they are dying, right? They can't stop what's happening. This country is getting more brown and more queer as the days go by. And they can't do anything about it. I end almost every talk saying, their babies are gonna be brown and wrapped in rainbows. And they can't. And we are at the forefront of that, y'all, so we have to keep our foot on the gas. We have to keep our foot, but we can't do that without resources, right? We can't keep our foot on the gas if there ain't no gas. So we have to keep pushing, and remember, we are winning. They're dying, and that's why they're fighting to save their lives. And I'm not gonna say the last part of that. They're gonna die either way. Anyway, thank you.
On that note, thank you, Tarana, Maheen, and Aleyamma so much. And thank you, Women's Funding Network and Schusterman and Pivotal Ventures for putting this together.